But before I start, I just want to show like a quick montage. So it's actually a very good friend of mine. He has done a number of documentaries in Pakistan. He's a filmmaker, and so he let me use some of his clips to create this sort of scenes of Lahore, especially the older parts. And the song that I picked, it's actually a pop rock song popular in Pakistan, but I only chose it because even the song, when it came out, it had this music video with driving through Lahore and scenes from Lahore. So it made sense to have the same song here. This is just to get into sort of like an atmosphere, the mood of the city. Get into that spirit of Lahore. So a few quick facts about Lahore. It is the second largest city of Pakistan, and the country Pakistan is essentially 4 provinces, and this is the capital of the major province Punjab. Punjab is a province which was divided between Pakistan and India, so you have Punjab on both sides of the border. And historically, Lahore was often referred to as the city of gardens, and I'll also go into that. And of course, because of the new urban developments, that's also kind of fading away. So it's not exactly fair to call it the city of gardens now. And it has always been a cultural hub. So all the arts and crafts and poetry and literature. Lahore produced a lot of poets, a lot of philosophers in its time, and even today, for example, even right now, it's where the literature festival of Pakistan takes place. The people of Lahore, as in like one of the reasons why I like the city so much is the people, that they're very hospitable, very friendly, very open to outsiders, and they love food. Their life is pretty much all about food, about eating. It's a common joke that the only question a Lahori person is thinking, okay, where's my next meal? And I mean, so much so that there are actually roads simply called the food streets, where it's just restaurants going from one end to the end and nothing else. It has had a very violent history, a lot of power struggles, a lot of wars, assassinations, a lot of dark times, tragic moments. It has always been invaded by different forces throughout its history. So it's not something like if there's a change in power, it's not something that's completely new for the locals. Right now, as in the last estimate, the population of Lahore is around 11 million. That's the estimate from last year. There are essentially three major cities of Pakistan. So you have Karachi, which is a cosmopolitan coastal city. That's on the southern extreme of Pakistan, like where the sea meets the land. And then you have the capital, which is kind of pretty much in the north, Islamabad, and then you have Lahore somewhere in the middle. So these three cities have very distinct characteristics. So even these images can actually show you that Karachi, being a very dense commercial and industrial hub of the country, even the architecture, it's full of skyscrapers and high-rises and a very fast-paced life. And Islamabad is pretty much embedded in a very beautiful landscape. It was a planned city. It's an not an organic city, and it was just created just a few decades ago. So you have both these extreme cities, like Karachi is the city of people who never sleep, and Islamabad, like the stereotype is, Islamabad is the city where people sleep too early. And then you have Lahore somewhere in the mid, where you have a very lively culture, and it's sort of in between in these two cities. Now, the city Lahore is very ancient, and no one really knows where it came from, where the first settlers came in. There's no historical record. There are only myths and legends and folklore. Of course, a lot of historians have proved that a lot of those myths are not true. And so pretty much no one has been able to pinpoint where exactly Lahore started. And one of the reasons it probably existed was because it existed on sort of the major trade routes, ancient trade routes between parts of Asia and parts of, let's say, Europe, between West and East. So you even have like trade routes going to China through this region. So this is pretty much a crossing between different trade regions. So it of course made sense at some point for people to settle in for commerce and trade. The first ever reference about Lahore is not exactly even a specific reference. It's just something that historians agree on, that it might be referring to Lahore, because even the name is not used. Is actually in 2nd century by Greek astronomer Ptolemy, and he calls it Labokla. So he just gives a reference that there's a city alongside a river which is part of the Indus River, and that's somehow we're able to estimate that he's probably talking about this. And there's even a Chinese traveler who explored a lot of parts and wrote about a lot of places he went to. I'm not sure how to pronounce this name. So he wrote about Lahore in 630 AD, 7th century. And it's much later on, around 10th century or 9th century, where you actually see people writing about Lahore, and you sort of have this recorded history, but even that is pretty vague, not accurate, because problem is, I'll go into that afterwards as well, that a lot of ancient history is written from only one point of view, and that is the point of view of the ruler. So of course they have a very strong bias on, and they don't usually talk about how people, the common people, were living in those cities. And because it was situated on trade routes, so it always had settlers coming in from different parts of the world, from different clans, different tribes settling in, and so it was always seen a lot of migration. So not a very closed city, always open to visitors. And because of that, it became not just an important marketplace, but also an important place for military rulers to come in, because anyone who had to secure this region or conquer this region would need to secure Lahore as well, because that would be sort of a line of defense. And because of that, it has been invaded many times. And even there are multiple incidents where people of Lahore, they would let the invaders come in. So, for example, there's one ruler in Lahore and the locals are not exactly happy with the ruler, with the taxes and everything. And so they would maybe come across another invader looking to conquer Lahore, and they would sort of cut a deal. Okay, we'll let you come into the city, we'll just tell the guards to ignore, and you can just come and take over, be a new ruler, and just, renegotiate the taxes or whatever. And so even the citizens of Lahore were kind of responsible for these invasions, so you have a lot of these power shifts. And because of that, a lot of different cultures came and went through the city. So you have this multicultural tradition, not exactly originating from one place. And over time, because of its importance as a military post, there were forts built, walls and gates, which were of course an important part of the built environment of Lahore. So that's the major part of the lecture is going to be focusing on that part of Lahore, which was fortified and had walls around it, which is today called as the walled city of Lahore. So walled city are those medieval or ancient cities which had a very defined boundary, and maybe some towns or suburbs outside the wall, but the major city would be situated inside the walls, and inside the walls you would have your religious buildings, you would have your administration, you would have your rulers, your fort, palace, all sorts of those important functions would be situated inside the wall, and the wall would be sort of this defense against invaders. And Lahore specifically existed within those walled boundaries for much of its history, at least until the Britishers came in. It had very specific points of entry and exit. That was of course for security, but then again, because the locals were often somewhat allowing invaders, so they would just open up one of these gates and the invaders would come in. And these walls were built by different civilizations over different times. So the boundary right now is kind of what the Mughal emperors and the Sikh rulers made around Lahore. Of course, much of it has been lost because of the constant power struggles and the violence, but you still see some of the walls in some sections of the city. And it still is, this creates a divide between the atmosphere, this city within the city. And then as soon as you cross the wall, it's like you're in a completely different world, and as soon as you step outside, it's a completely different city. A lot of the walls have been, of course, neglected over time, but now there are efforts to rebuild a lot of that. So it had 13 gates, at least 13 which were documented or which were properly constructed over time. And those gates had different names, and the names would depend upon the route on which the gate is placed. So, for example, this image is of the Delhi gate, and Delhi is a city in India. So this was the gate which actually had the road connecting to India and Delhi. So you had Kashmir gate, which faced Kashmir, or you might have gates named after, let's say, the major commercial activity happening there. So if there's like one kind of crafting or handicraft going on at one gate, you will name the gate after that. That also indicates a very fascinating fact about the city, because no one has been able to pinpoint where Lahore actually started. There's actually one theory that it's not even the walled city which is Lahore, that the actual Lahore started away from the wall, and the hint is that one of the gates is actually called Lahore Gate. So, because the naming was done, in regards to different areas or cities, so the theory is that because Lahore existed somewhere outside the wall, so the gate facing it was called the Lahore Gate. But of course, that's still pretty much a theory. And right now, only 6 of these gates survive. So one of them is the Delhi Gate, which has been restored and constructed over time. And this gate was of course really important because this was the main gate through which rulers of the city entered, especially the Mughal rulers. So this would be the royal passage. Coming in from India, the rulers would be entering this gate, this huge heighted space with lots of elephants, and this is where they would sort of go towards the palace, the fort. So I'm just going to give you like a short tour of the city. But before that, this is the current map of the Lahore city. So you have this major ring road, like how you have in Shanghai, you have the airport, and you have all of these later developments, and the walled city itself is only situated here. So it's this small part of Lahore, so it's essentially one city, an island contained inside a bigger city. And this is a 19th century wooden model of how old Lahore used to look like. So you have these fortifications, you have all of these gates. So this is Kashmir Gate, and this is the Delhi Gate, which I'll be showing you guys. And this is the main fort area. And why the fort was situated in this corner was because Lahore was actually built with a river in mind. So one of the rivers called the Ravi River actually is a branch of the Indus River. So it used to flow right outside the city, and you have the river going from right, pretty much covering this corner and going around the fort. So the river would be a natural defense of the fort, and you would only have to guard these other sections of the city. Of course, over time the river has shifted a lot, so there's like 2 to 3 kilometers difference now. So these are the different timelines, the different eras of Lahore, and of course ruled by different people, different civilizations. The earliest records of Lahore go back to when Hindus, which was the main religion of that region for a lot of centuries, the oldest religion in that area. So Hindus were actually the original rulers of the city, at least as far as the records show, and they sort of, you have these records going back to, like I said, Ptolemy in 2nd century. And then the next period, major period, comes in with the Islamic Invasion, something which I mentioned in the last lecture, and that was around 1015 AD. And then you have the Mughal Islamic, which is of course a different dynasty, a different civilization, still Muslim rulers, but they were actually Persian and Central Asian descendants, and they kind of took over Lahore. A major difference between these 2 Islamic periods is that the first Islamic period, the Ghaznavid, they didn't really give the city much importance. They still had their capital inside Persia, actually around Baghdad, in another city. So they only used Lahore as sort of like a station, a point, an outside point, but not really the capital. But when the Mughals came in, they sort of declared Lahore as the capital. So you see that the later Islamic rulers did a lot more development than the previous ones. And then you have the Sikh rulers in 1780. They took over from the Mughal Empire. Sikh religion is actually comparatively a much recent religion, and this religion actually started from this region and this province. So you could say that this was the only time when the city was ruled by locals, and before that it was pretty much outside tribes, outside invaders coming from different parts of the world. And the Sikhs didn't really rule for a long time, and they didn't really develop much, but they still kind of maintained Lahore as their center. Even today, because a lot of their important religious ceremonies take place in Lahore, so every year you have these Sikh populations coming in from India for their religious ceremonies. And then in 1850 you have the British, the colonial settlement, and that they really changed the built environment drastically. And they were in this region up till the partition of the subcontinent, and then that's where Pakistan was created in 1947. So that's the current era of Lahore. This lithograph on the right side actually shows Lahore in a much damaged state. This is the Bathhouse Mosque, which we saw in the last lecture, with the damaged minarets and the wall of the city and this Sikh army moving in. So right now when you look at the walled city, it can be a very chaotic, complex place. You have these very dense populations, and this complexity of the walled city is basically why the Britishers took a lot of their decisions not exactly in favor of the city as we see now. But the thing to understand about the city is that it may seem random at first, like at first glance, but it's actually a very intricate, layered system of public interaction, of private spaces, of religious spaces, and they sort of have this very harmonious way of living, which is still kind of intact today. So this is, as you enter the walled city, you have Delhi Gate, which was the royal passageway, and you can see the height of the arch is basically made for elephants. So the route from the Delhi Gate to the palace would be called the Shahi Guzargah, or in English that would be the royal passageway, because this was the route which was taken by the prince and the kings, and people would be lining up along these streets to greet them. And inside each of these gates you have this enormous space, and even today there are, like today inside Delhi Gate you have tourism offices, you have sort of like a reception to the city where you can get some information, and even today a lot of people are still living in that walled city. And even after so many changes, the city inside the walls hasn't changed much. That's also because, of course, it was contained in a boundary. So these two photographs are actually more than 100 years apart. The right one being a much recent one, and the left being taken during the colonial period. You can see pretty much the streets and the shops are, of course, pretty much the same. People are living in the same habits with the same routines. Of course, this is the Shahi Guzargah, the royal passageway. Of course, the right-hand photograph is much recent after a lot of restoration was done. So that's why you see actually a lot of these buildings in much better condition as compared to the ones on the left. And the average routine of a person living inside Lahore, the walled city, the routine would start pretty much as the sun rises, and the first thing would be to have a good breakfast, because the people of the city love food. So you have all of these restaurants and cooks and chefs in every part of the street making something right from the morning, right after the morning prayers. And then you have different businesses, different crafting, from musical instruments to handicraft to pottery, ceramics. And these areas, different parts of the walled city would be specializing in one way. So if you needed to buy a musical instrument, you would actually go to a specific area. If you needed pottery, you would go to another specific area. So all of these areas were kind of specialized in what they were producing. And whereas the residential life, that was pretty much contained within the very narrow streets. So it may seem claustrophobic now, but it's important to the life of the people, because this is how they sort of interact with one another. These close proximity would mean that people living in one house would be pretty much familiar with people living in the next house or the house opposite, and they would always know what's happening around. That's also a reason why a lot of these areas are very secure, very safe, because of course everyone knows everyone as soon as an outsider enters into these streets, so everyone knows that this is a person who's probably trespassing. And the houses would be so close in together because of climatic and economic reasons that they would be pretty much in conversation reach of each other. So you could be in your house talking to your neighbors without actually leaving your house. So that's the kind of lifestyle, and because all these families were living in one place, so your family might be living in one house, your uncle, your cousins might be in the house opposite. So these very close, integrated micro societies in these cities. And even as nighttime approaches, you still have a very vibrant, colorful way of life in the commercial areas as well as the residential ones. And you can sort of end your day with one of these food streets which I mentioned. And you can just simply, in the view of the Grand Mosque or the fort, you can have a nice dinner. So this is the walled city, and this area which is kind of highlighted in the middle, that is where the growth started. So this is the older part of this, the oldest part of the city. Of course, because of this complex built environment, it's not exactly possible to dig up and see what's down there. There have been few archaeological surveys, but they can't be carried out much extensively, as we might need to understand the city better. But as far as estimates go, this is probably where the city started, and it sort of grew outwards, and over time different walls were built. And if we look at the street structure, so it functions in a way is that you have your primary routes, which is this wide road called the Guzar, the passageway. Then you have your secondary streets, and then you have your tertiary streets. So eventually they sort of branch off into dead ends, sort of like the cul-de-sacs of that time. So how the people would be distributed is that either one area would be dominated by one religion, because you had multiple religions. You had Muslims, you had Hindus, you had Sikhs. So they each had different regions where they would be in a majority. And then just like a family tree, so you would have different communities being divided into smaller and smaller groups until you actually reach this mohalla level or this kucha level, which is sort of where the cul-de-sac ends. So you will have maybe just one family living at this point, and then another over here. So as soon as you are going in deeper into the streets, you would be sort of closing in on the demographic or the family units. So this is essentially how people were interacting with each other. And this is basically helps to cut down on that level of complexity that the city seems to have. And then the houses themselves, even though people belonged to different religions, they still had the same sort of a common culture. And one of the important parts of that culture was this need for privacy. Every family in that region needed a private space, this very clear distinction between what's public and what's private. So most of these homes were built around the courtyard model. So each house would have a central open space, a void in the middle, and all of the rooms would be situated alongside the courtyards. And because the areas were very limited, because over time as new generations came in, they would simply divide up the land, divide up the building, and one family's house might be divided into two family houses in that same area. And then again, they would have their own courtyard and their own spaces. So the courtyard was an essential part of these homes. And the courtyard had multiple functions. One was to function as a climatic device, because Lahore has an extreme heat and extreme winter. So the courtyard would have this stacking effect, so that hot air would be rising through the courtyard and pulling in hot air from the rooms, and so to have like an overall cooling effect. And the courtyard would be sort of like a semi-public space, where you would have your friends, your gathering spaces, all of the ceremonies, gatherings happening within that courtyard. And then the rooms at the back of the courtyard would be much more private spaces. There was also gender segregation in a lot of these homes. So you might have the men mostly having their work or activities or living spaces on the ground level, and the women on the upper levels. So you had these multiple levels around the central courtyard, these very compact houses. And also another key fact is that all of these houses, they didn't really have any spaces between them. And that's also because of climatic reasons and economic reasons. So you might not need a different foundation or a shear wall of your own. You might actually use these surrounding buildings as your structural support. And because of this close, let's say, overlap between the houses, you have these masses of structures and buildings. So one house would be giving thermal protection to the next house and the next house and the next house. And also because Lahore had always had a problem of a lot of dust in the dry seasons. So this kind of narrow spaces would actually eliminate that problem, and because the houses were so close together, so all the streets were pretty much shaded. And this was how people live, at least even today, they live in the walled city, but that even changed much later on. But this was how primarily they were living, in these small, compact, multi-level courtyard houses. Now coming back to some key buildings, of course because of the constant wars and struggles, a lot of the older buildings are only found in books and records, but you don't actually see them anymore. So this is one of the oldest surviving buildings, and this is actually before Mughal rulers came into the city. So this is a 15th century Islamic architecture mosque, and this is called the Noori Mosque. And Noori means down below. And why it's called down below is because this mosque is actually below ground level. This is the only surviving building which is at least 20 feet. So 20 feet would be, I guess, 8 meters? 7 to 8 meters below ground. And there are records that other such buildings also existed which were below ground level. The only reason that they were below ground level is because a lot of Hindu temples in this area used to be down below. So you had this tunnel going into very dark places with very limited light. And of course when Muslims took over, they used the existing Hindu buildings, they destroyed them, and they made their own religious buildings on top of that. So that's why you had some of these mosques which were actually down below. So this is the only surviving building from that time, and it's still pretty much, at least a lot of the elements of this building are still in its original state. So on the left you have this sort of bird's eye view, and on the right you can actually see so this doorway in front. So this is a photograph taken from the street level, and down below you can actually see the entrance to the mosque. So you would actually go down below many steps and then enter the mosque, and that's only because the Muslims were using some of the examples I covered in the last lecture as well, that they were pretty much destroying and using the Hindu temples for material, for foundation, for structure, for all of those reasons. And interestingly enough, this mosque does not have a flooding problem, even though it's pretty much down below ground. And the reason is that the city has a very complex, intricate drainage system, which still people haven't been able to figure out because they can't exactly dig in these areas. But a lot of these drainage systems are still functional today. And then comes the Mughal time. This is when Lahore became actually a capital of any civilization, and the Mughal rulers really sped up the development of the city. So they made a lot of monuments, a lot of interesting buildings. This building in particular, the Wazir Khan Mosque, it's situated right inside the walled city. This is the one which I showed here. So this is from the top, and even here you can see the minarets of the Wazir Khan Mosque. So it's a very central mosque to this area. And another reason why it's so important, even in terms of Islamic architecture or Lahore in general, is that it's very the most ornamental, the most vivid, and the most lively of the designs when it comes to mosque. Even today, it's really amazing to look at the amount of detail, the frescoes, the paintings that are done inside the mosque. So this was made around 17th century. This wasn't actually built by a Muslim ruler, but by actually one of the governors who was a sort of like a doctor, a medical expert in that era, and he was the governor of the city. And Wazir is just a title, so it's not the name of the person. So Wazir simply means someone who is an administrator. So he's the one who actually got this mosque built. And this is one of the arches inside the mosque, and you can see some of those geometric patterns, those organic patterns, and the Arabic calligraphy, but done at a much more complex level as compared to other examples of Islamic architecture. And you can see this very bold use of colors, very bright colors throughout the building. And I believe you were looking at examples of truck art from Pakistan, and you can see that similarity between the colors being used, and so essentially this kind of aesthetics was pretty much part of this area for a lot of centuries. So even today you can actually see this kind of influence on the local crafts, this colorful, complex aesthetic. And everywhere you go, you have these very interesting patterns throughout the mosque. Even today, it's used as a major public space. So one major reason for having such large religious spaces, at least in Lahore, was that they also functioned as a social space. So, for example, if you had a wedding or a funeral, so the major ritual of that event would be happening inside the mosque or in its courtyard, and people from all over the city would be gathering here. So not just simply a place to worship, but also a place to interact with one another, a place to grieve, a place to celebrate, to have different festivals and events. Even today, it's like a very popular place to get a wedding photo shoot and a wedding ceremony done. And even inside the mosque, you had these marketplaces. So because this was essentially a social node. So not only it had social spaces for people to interact, but also commercial spaces within to sort of generate and attract user activity. Even the space outside the mosque, it always had this sort of a wide open area where people traveling from other regions of the world would maybe set up shop here, maybe sell goods, maybe discuss ideas, maybe have some arts and crafts here. So even today, after restoration, we still have this. Of course, this restoration was done recently. So for a lot of years, there were a lot of encroachments and structures built, sort of taking away the social aspect. But now, a lot of it has been reclaimed, and even today, it's common to have maybe like a classical musical event here, or maybe some kind of a lecture space, or any kind of an exhibition outside the mosque. So in a way, the mosque still has retained pretty much its role which it had centuries ago. And then the next important part of this walled city is the Shahi Hammam, or the royal bathhouse. So a lot of the bathhouses were created, and that was an important function in the walled city. So you had these specific buildings for steamed baths, for hot baths, for people to come and relax. None of those bathhouses have survived. They're only mentioned in books. This is the only one surviving, of course, because this was the royal bathhouse. So this was not exactly for common people, but more for the royal rulers and maybe the guests. And this is situated right next to the gate which I showed. So typically, if you would have guests coming in, royal guests, of course, people would be traveling for days, they would be very tired, exhausted. So as soon as they would enter, they would be first taken to the bathhouse to relax, to maybe have a nice bath, and maybe spend the first night in one of the buildings across the bath, and then maybe the next day they would then go to the palace. So this pathway between the gate and the palace, with the bathhouse in between and the grand mosque, this mosque is also situated on that path. So these architecture buildings would become part of the ritual, this coming into the city, of welcoming a guest, and sort of, this effort of the rulers to make sure that the guests coming in would be impressed with the city. So they would first spend a night at the bathhouse, and then the next day would be spent at the mosque, and then they would go to the palace. So this is not the only bathhouse that has been surviving, and recently got restored just a few years back. So you have some of the plans, and again very intricate Islamic geometric patterns. This was also made by the same person who got the mosque built by Wazir Khan, and so this is a much more closed and intimate space. You don't have a lot of direct light coming in. You only have these domes with very small skylights to diffuse light, because you needed a space for people to be sort of cut away from the noisy or the very active life happening outside, and here it would be just a place to, maybe a quiet place to relax. This is one exception of Islamic architecture, because here you can see two images of angels done in an Islamic aesthetic pattern. Of course, I said last time that representation of any kind is not exactly part of Islamic architecture, but of course there are a few exceptions. Now, two reasons why this might be an exception in this case is because, number one, this is not a religious building, so this is more of a relaxation space. And second, because this is a much more private space, so this exception, this image of the angel is only done on the inside, so it's not exactly visible from the outside. And if you are talking about the bathhouse, so you would imagine that people inside would be already in a kind of exposed state. So I guess they were much more lenient with these kinds of principles. So you would have these different spaces with different kinds of bathhouses. So you would have one space for just steam, one for hot water, one for maybe some moderate water. And these are the different courtyards, and you would have like a proper reception as soon as you enter, a proper reception where you would sort of hand in your belongings, your clothes, and you would even have a separate area for the females and a different area for the males. And it was pretty much an essential part of the lifestyle in the city. And this is something that was dug up and found during the recent excavations by the Aga Khan Foundation. So this is the whole system, the thermal bath system, where steam and hot water would be traveling underneath the floors. So you would have heated floors throughout the building, and you would of course be using coal to generate that heat, using wood to sort of have that high temperature. And after that, another major typology is called the Haveli. Now this is kind of, you can say in very simple terms, like a mansion, a townhouse or a mansion. And these would be very important in this part, especially in the upper classes of the society. So these would be residential complexes with much bigger in scale than a typical home, much more ornamental, because of course people living in the lower classes would not have the means to have very ornamental houses or to have the same kind of crafting as seen in Islamic architecture in the monumental buildings. But the Haveli would be an exception, because these houses would be belonging to the much more richer, more powerful families, and of course they had the means to decorate it. And even if this was a much more larger and more, I would say, a significant residential complex in the old city, but it would still be modeled on the same principle of the courtyard. Like even in the Haveli, you have this huge courtyard having the same kind of functions and the same kind of element of privacy and public spaces. And the only difference would be the scale and the amount of rooms. So you would have a lot of rooms for guests, for your friends, and maybe your relatives. So extended families would be living inside one Haveli. And again, a lot of these Havelis are either right now in a very bad condition or completely destroyed. This is the one Haveli I'm going to show is like one of the surviving Havelis, and it only pretty much survived because it was given a new function, and that was basically it. Now school. So this is the non-inhabited Singh Haveli, and this was made in the Sikh era. So the Sikh architecture is basically a mix of Islamic and Hindu and all the different aesthetic elements. So it may seem like a continuation of Islamic architecture, but there are certain things which, of course, make it different. For example, the overall building is not following any strict symmetry, because that is a crucial part of Islamic architecture. It needs to have a proper symmetrical proportion. And this house is pretty much asymmetrical. So you have this one mass attached to this higher mass, and you only observe symmetry in smaller segments of the building, but not as a whole. And of course, a lot of the ornamentation was Islamic, but they added their own elements, some Hindu elements. So this was built around 1850. This was essentially made for and by one of the grandsons of the Sikh ruler. And in the colonial times, it was converted into a school for girls, and it still is today a school for girls. So that's probably one of the reasons why it's still surviving. So some close-up detail of this Haveli, and you can see that on the outside you have some animal representation. So it's not very clear in this photograph, but you can have these sort of lion figures. And this is the central courtyard of the Haveli. So you can see that the same level of detail but now applied to a residential complex. And this continuous array of rooms, much smaller in size but focusing more on the quantity of the rooms, and the floor to ceiling height will be much larger to have good natural ventilation with the sunroom on the top. This is the sort of like the sunroom on the top, and all of these reflective pieces are actually pieces of glass. So this would be called a sheesh mahal or a mirror palace. So sort of this small sunroom, and this was a common space in a lot of major buildings from that era. That even the fort has one. So this would be like a small pavilion, and the reason for this pavilion would be to have just to enjoy a view of the city. So this panoramic view of the city, and that's why you have a lot of glass. So you would be sort of spending your mornings in there, just relaxing, maybe having a meal or maybe having a nice conversation or reading, and all of these different parts of the mirror would be actually reflecting light in smaller images of the city, sort of bringing in images inside. And inside this, you now again see that a lot of the paintings and the frescoes are actually from Hindu mythology, because this is not exactly a building done by a Muslim architect or for Muslim architecture. So you have a lot of these images, a lot of these details borrowed from Hindu mythology, Hindu aesthetics, and their sort of figures. So again, that glimpse of the lion, and even here some of the buttresses and supports are sort of in this serpentine sculptural formation. And this is how it's being used today. So you have all the different classrooms, and the courtyard is used by the students. And then came the after the Mughal and the Sikh era came the colonial era. So this was actually a very disruptive time for Lahore as a city. The Britishers first came into this region, subcontinent, in 1600s. That's the time where all of the European countries were sending out trading convoys to trade with other regions, and of course, over time, they pretty much conquered all of those spaces they were kind of trading with. So Britishers in this example, they came into subcontinent as the East India Company in 1600s, and their main agenda at that time was to trade spices and trade minerals. And over time, this sort of started to gain political importance, political influence, got close to the leaders, and started having an effect on the politics of the area. And over time, by 1800s, they were pretty much a ruling majority in the region. In 1849, they essentially officially took over Lahore. Another reason why it was possible for them to take over was because there was a lot of political instability in a lot of these cities. So because of different groups fighting with each other, assassinating one another, very Game of Thrones style people killing their relatives, their cousins and brothers, and having these weird, complex plots to get power. So eventually, of course, people were greedy for power, and the Britishers had this perfect opportunity because right now, in 1849, the Sikh government was actually ruled by a kid. So Dalip Singh was the Sikh ruler, and he was only like 10 years old when the Britishers came. So it was pretty much easy for British to sort of force the family to give up the entire city. There's actually a very tragic tale that the Dalip Singh, when he was only like 10, 15 years old, the Britishers came in, they sort of took over the city, and they even had him kidnapped and took him to London and converted him into a Christian, sort of brainwashing him and making him one of his own, just so they could have his family, given to their demands. After a lot of struggle and wars in 1849, the Britishers declared Lahore as part of the British Empire. And in 1849, after the war was ended, a lot of Lahore was pretty much destroyed. A lot of walls, the gates, forts, houses, a lot of it was destroyed. And so you have these moments in Lahore's history where things go backwards very quickly because of the wars, and it takes time for it to recover again. And so for the next century, Lahore was pretty much under the British rule. And they made a lot of major changes to the urban and the built environment, because up till now, Lahore was pretty much contained within these walls. And you would still have different towns, suburbs, gardens, pavilions outside the walls, but the actual city was pretty much inside. But when the Britishers came in, of course, they took over after a very violent war, so they didn't want any of that happening again. They didn't want any locals to create another army and sort of challenge them. So they pretty much avoided the walled city. They didn't really do much inside. They didn't live inside. They created all of these centers away from the walled city because they were not able to understand the complexity of the city. So of course it was very dangerous for them and very risky for them to be inside a city with which they're not familiar with. So as a whole, they pretty much, out of fear, they didn't really touch upon the walled city, and whatever development they did, whatever expansion they did, it was done away. So this is a time when Lahore really started to expand horizontally and is still expanding today. Another reason for that is actually a medical reason. So right now we have a clear understanding of how diseases are spread. You have the germ theory, you have your understanding of bacteria, but when the Britishers took over, you didn't have your germ theory. You had an older model of medical sciences, which was the miasma theory, and under that theory, the understanding was that diseases are spread through the air, and not through germs, but simply having this dirty air. So if you breathe the dirty air, you would get sick. And this was the common belief at that time, and because of that, they completely avoided the walled city. They didn't want their soldiers to be getting sick, so they just decided to have as much distance possible so that people would not get sick. And again, that idea of being sick was not, there was a lot of disease and outbreak, but that was also because the foreigners, settlers, they were not used to the climate of the city. So of course they were getting sick. But their understanding was that people of Lahore are very filthy, very dirty, and as soon as we come near them, we will get sick. So this kind of very weird, superficial understanding of the locals, that's actually why they sort of kept the distance. And this is a common theme if you look at any colonial history. You see this attitude of foreign settlers towards locals, because any colonial rule starts with this idea that the Britishers are coming in from a superior culture, and whatever city or country they are ruling is an inferior culture, and they're backwards, they're savages, they're barbaric, and the British are now going to save the civilization. They're going to make sure that they're groomed well, that they become, much more like Europeans, like gentlemen. And so that's the kind of mindset which basically influenced most of their, well, actually all of their architectural decisions or the urban planning decisions, and the disease being one of them. So because they thought that the locals are just too disgusting or too filthy, so they kind of kept the distance. It had a positive effect that they were able to, because they were sort of expanding outside Lahore, so they had pretty much like blank space. So they were able to develop a lot of the infrastructure. So one good thing out of the colonial rule is that a lot of the infrastructure was developed, which was lacking. A lot of people still argue what was the golden time for the locals. People have these debates that, okay, which was the worst time, which was the best time. But truth is that each of the rulers had problems. Like the Mughal rulers or the Sikh rulers, of course, they were locals and they were sort of from the same culture, but you had a lot of difference between the ruling elite and the lower classes. There was no middle class, so it was pretty much a dictatorship even back then. But the Britishers, what they did was they actually developed the education system, a modern education system, a modern infrastructure system, and thanks to them, my education is pretty much in English. Everyone in Pakistan today speaks English, and that's all because of the colonial rule. And a lot of the built environment that we're used to in Pakistan today is because of the British. So it's not to say that everything was bad, of course. They had their agenda, they had their motivation for why they were building these things, but they still sort of left behind some good infrastructure. But this infrastructure, because it was done from this attitude, this oriental attitude that they're helping a backward culture. So what was happening was that there was this cultural alienation, that the locals were being pushed away from their own culture, their own heritage, their own tradition, and the Britishers were constantly trying to convert them into Indian Britishers, or basically more English. And that is what created a lot of problems in terms of culture, architecture, and society. And the styles that they used were pretty much mixed. So you have three different types. You have Gothic architecture, you have Victorian, and then you have Mughal. And you have different cases where British architects actually mixed all of these styles. And they did so to varying degrees. So you might have one building which would be completely Gothic, completely Victorian. You might have one building which would be like a different mix of Mughal, Islamic, and British. So you have all sorts of examples from that time. Now this is a map of Lahore from 1893. So this is after the British pretty much established themselves. And the red part over here, you can actually see the label called a City of Lahore. And the Britishers actually settled over here, this yellow outline. So this is their main military base which they established back then and is still being used by the military today. Of course, the British colonial system in terms of military still being used in Pakistan. So even today, military cantonment, as it's called, is still situated in this area. And they developed all of their important landscape and important buildings of civic use along this axis, which was then called the Mall Road and is still called the Mall Road today. So you had the city, you had this extensive road, and then you had the major British settlements. So this was one of the major projects done by the Britishers after they took over Lahore. So of course, the Britishers wanted their own lifestyle to be implemented in the city of Lahore. They didn't really agree with the lifestyle, they didn't understand. They didn't actually even make an effort to understand because they assumed that the culture existing is pretty much backwards. So they didn't really even bother to understand how the social spaces function in that region. So they simply started making whatever they were making in Britain. They started making the same kind of spaces, the same kind of buildings. These are two different halls, Lawrence and Montgomery halls, named after Lord Lawrence and Lord Montgomery in 1861. So the Lawrence Hall was actually made first, the one on the left, with this Greek pediment and columns and pretty much like a European classical building lifted from Europe and planted in Lahore. And a couple of years later, they added actually a second hall, the Montgomery Hall. So the purpose of this hall was to have a social space, sort of like a ballroom, a gathering space for the now ruling British elite. And the second hall was created as a sort of interface where they would actually invite Indian elite class and sort of interact with them. But still, the Indian elite class would be arriving into a very European space to make sure that it is pretty much clear that who's in charge of things around here. So one purpose of this architecture was to bring sort of have the kind of social spaces that they were used to. But the second major purpose of this kind of architecture was to make the locals realize that now there's a new ruling party and they are the new decision makers of the city. And this is how we have it today. So after partition, this was turned into a library and named after the founding father of the country, the Quaid-e-Azam Library. And you have Lawrence Garden, huge landscape areas around the building, and it's still pretty much kept in its original state. The only difference is that now it's functioning as a library. Even the interior spaces are pretty much preserved in that manner. Even though these buildings were used for a political purpose, but still it would seem unwise to actually destroy a lot of these buildings, because we have to agree that whatever built environment exists, it shapes up the culture in the following years. So that's why a lot of this architecture is still important. The next major building that they did was the railway station, because Lahore was a major trading place and the Britishers felt that you need a proper railway network to actually speed up the industrial revolution and to have easy transportation of goods and military between different cities. So they actually started building this railway network, and one of the major railway stations was constructed in Lahore. Now, even though both of these structures were made in the same kind of year, so just 1 year apart, but the kind of emotions or the kind of atmosphere the city had, that really changes between the two buildings. And that's also because this railway station is situated right next to the old city, which the Britishers were scared of. Here they're pretty much arrogant. You can see that kind of attitude that, okay, we are the new rulers, this is our architecture, this is what the built environment is going to be. But now they needed this railway station, but it had to be situated close to the old city, and this is 1860. And just 3 years ago, they had major wars with the locals, so they were pretty much afraid of going into this region. So this railway station was actually built like a military fort. So the purpose of this railway station was to be bulletproof. And that's actually seen in the architecture. So for example, these towers built inside the railway station, you can actually see this very narrow vertical slits. These were only placed there so that you could have your guns inside them. So in the case of an attack, you would be able to defend the railway station. So two different architecture buildings in the same time period, but because of their location close to or far away from the actual city. So you have one building based on sort of this pride and arrogance, and the other one based on fear. They just didn't want to risk it, so they wanted, because even the British soldiers would be traveling from this place, so they wanted to make sure that it is a very secure, bomb-proof, fireproof, bulletproof space, easy to defend. And inside you still have these sort of English elements, these Gothic towers, these clock towers inside them, but still some elements taken from the local architecture. And this is how it is today. The railway station, still one of the major railway stations of the country, still pretty much being used as it was done back in the day. So a good thing about these buildings is that you really get a sense of the time. So as soon as you enter the walled city or these older parts of Lahore, it's pretty much like traveling back in time, looking at the same kind of architecture, the same kind of spaces, with only minor changes. So the only thing that would have changed in this time would be better electricity and maybe some newer shops. Because, well, today there's like a Pizza Hut and McDonald's inside the railway station. That's the only modern addition to this railway station. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to develop the railway network. We're still pretty much using the same system as the Britishers made it. So this was pretty much the Victorian or the English approach to Lahore. But then after time, as this sort of started settling in, the locals slowly started accepting the Britishers, and after many years, they were starting to influence the culture. So over time, the elite classes of Lahore wanted to be more like their rulers. Of course, if you were closer to rulers, so that meant that you would still be rich and wealthy with the new rulers. And of course, Lahore is used to having foreign invaders and foreign rulers, so it was just a different ruler, and now they had to make sure that they're friendly with the British. So you see this sort of cultural shift, locals being anglicized, I would say, and one of that was and that was evident in the architecture in itself. So a lot of architecture in the later time was a mix of British, English, Victorian, and a mix of Islamic and Mughal. And one of the key architects who was responsible for that was Bhairam Singh. So Bhairam Singh was born in 1958 after the British had taken over, and he was a master carpenter, like a famous carpenter from a very young age. Like even when he was a teenager, he was this legendary carpenter. So there's this old story that one of the English lords living in Lahore, they had a piano which needed to be repaired and no one could repair it, and someone told them there's this boy in this village and he's like a master carpenter and he can fix your piano, and he did. So they brought him back to Lahore and to make sure that he trains under British rulers. He joined the Mayo School of Arts under Lockwood Kipling. Lockwood Kipling is the father of Rudyard Kipling, the famous English author. Lockwood Kipling had a major role in the cultural development.
Is that year correct? Born 1958? Because that would mean he's only 60 now.
18.
Oh, sorry, 1858.
Oh,
That's
okay.
Oh,
I'm confused. I'm calculating.
Sorry,
Okay.
1858. So, 1858, so about
Okay, that
almost
makes sense.
two-
That makes
yeah.
sense, yeah.
pretty much when the Britishers took over. So, he was trained under Lockwood Kipling. Lockwood Kipling was an artist, a designer who came to India sort of to oversee the cultural development, the artistic training in India under the colonial rule. And he was shifted from Mumbai to Lahore after the Britishers took over. And Lockwood Kipling established the school called Mayo School of Arts, which is still an important school in Lahore. And Bhairam Singh was actually one of the first students in that school. So the Mayo School of Arts was actually a kind of a school where they wanted to train the local craftsmen with a more scientific approach to architecture and design by teaching them drawing and sculpture and drafting, and in a way to sort of have these local architects trained by the British. So naturally they would be having this style which would be a mix of two cultures. Again, this is a means of controlling the society, controlling the population, and at the same time being more acceptable for the locals. So the Mayo School of Arts was an important part of that system. And Lockwood Kipling, being the first principal, was actually personally responsible for a lot of these things. Again, that whole attitude of this inferior versus superior culture, one of the reasons why the school was made was, like, if you go into documents regarding the school, the major consensus was that the locals don't have any artistic abilities. Even seeing examples such as the Wazir Mosque and Islamic architecture, they were still in complete denial that the local crafting was any good compared to British standards. And the whole idea was that unless we teach them, they're going to be savages. So Bhai Ram Singh was sort of part of that project. There were also other architects, civil engineers. There was another civil engineer and contractor called Sir Gangaram, and he was also a major philanthropist. So Lockwood Kipling, Bhai Ram Singh, Gangaram, these were like the major builders of Lahore in the peak of the colonial era. And Bhai Ram Singh became like a legendary architect. Even today, he's considered as one of the most important architects in Lahore's history. Even in his 20s, he was winning architecture competitions. He was getting government projects, he was getting major projects. Even the first competition that he sort of competed in his 20s, it was pretty much a tie between a British architect and himself. So he was actually considered very good. Eventually, he was actually invited by the Queen herself to London to build for her. And he was known as the Queen's special architect. So he was actually a major figure responsible for this kind of mixture between Mughal and English style. Now, this is the Mayo School of Arts, which was established in 1875. Even the school itself, as it sort of grew, accepting more students and having more classes, so the architecture of the Mayo School of Arts is again a mixture of Victorian. So you have the verticality of the Gothic architecture with the narrow towers, and you have elements like the arches and the domes with much less ornamental detail from the Islamic architecture. So a lot of the architecture of this time is sort of this mixture. And this is sort of a very old colonial era photograph of how they were being trained in drafting and scientific approach to arts and design. And of course it still is an important part. The name was changed. Like a few decades ago, the name was changed to the National College of Arts, and this is the school where I actually did my bachelor's. So even today, it's actually one of the most important art schools of Pakistan and the toughest school to get into, because every year, even in architecture, they only like accept 50 students from the entire country, and everyone is pretty much competing. So for a long time, this was only one of the few architecture schools in the country. So the school is being used in its original state. So it's a heritage site, an important heritage site, and with some additions made to the building afterwards. And here you can see that they're still pretty much following the arch and some of the orientation, but a lot of it is pretty much modernized, streamlined, minimal in much sense. Also, brick was being heavily used. Brick was a standard material in Lahore, but as soon as the Britishers came in, they standardized the brick. So, because they introduced the imperial system, which we are still using now for some reason, so feet and inches, so the brick was actually set to a defined 4.5 inches by 3 by 9 inches. So that construction could be much more efficient and design would be much more easier. And next to the National College of Arts is the Lahore Museum. This was made as an extension of the school, because this one important function of the school was to have conservation of the existing buildings and the museum as a place to store all the artifacts. So even here you can actually see kind of like the Islamic dome, but elongated in a Gothic manner, and on top you have this mixture between a spire and a dome, sort of this elements of the cathedral coming in, this massing of the cathedral, but then you have these some arches following the Islamic style, some maybe Spanish, some more European. So you have these different mixes of architecture. Another important building, this is situated across the Punjab University. So these are done at different times, and these are all done by Bhai Ram Singh. So Bhai Ram Singh, he actually designed the school he studied in. He taught at the school he studied in. He was even the principal of the school for some time, and he designed this building as well as this, the Punjab University. Still is a functional and one of the oldest institutes of Pakistan. So in the three buildings, you can actually see these changing degrees. So some elements might be more English, some might be more Islamic. So that really didn't have a strict ruling system. It was pretty much based upon what they needed to do. So a general rule was that where Britishers needed to have a space of their own, separate from the Indians, separate from the locals, because even after decades of ruling, they still considered themselves superior to the locals, and the locals would be somewhat looked down upon, and in many cases treated as not exactly human. So slavery was common and all that. But they had this idea that if the building is going to function only for the British, then it has to be in the English style, in the classical Greek style. If it needs to be a place for both Indians and English, so it needs to be in this mixed hybrid style. Then in 1935, they made the Punjab Assembly Hall, and because this was a civic building made for the Britishers to rule over Lahore, so even though this building is made many years after these examples, you actually see that there's really no influence of Mughal or Islamic architecture, even though amazingly all of these buildings are situated on one road. The road that I mentioned between the British area and the old Lahore, the Mall Road, all of these buildings I'm showing are on the exact same road, and you can actually go from one building to the other on foot pretty easily. And still you have these very different styles, only based upon how they viewed themselves in the city, how they viewed the locals. So in this example, you see this bend because this is 1930s, even the English architecture was changing, so whatever style was common in that time, so this sort of brought in here. So this was before modern architecture really took on a major pace. So you actually see some of that, some glimpses of modern architecture over the horizon, with the kind of turning down of the ornamentation from the Greek styles. And this is kind of like an overview of the Mall Road. Like even today you have these, as soon as you go from one point of Mall Road to the other, you see this very diverse range of buildings done in very different kinds of styles in like a bracket of 50 to 100 years. And the road is essentially now an architectural museum. So you can simply just go from in a car and you would be going through this museum of architecture. And you have all of these buildings with different mixtures of styles. Again, purely Gothic, Mughal, and then a mix of two. All in the same region. Even so much so that this structure is actually facing this one, they're in the same area. And you would have these very drastic shifts in architectural styles. And that also changed how the people living were making their homes. Because of the time, people began accepting the new colonial rule, and they wanted to, of course, be more British. And this was the time when Lahore started having a taste of industrial revolution. So you would have factories, and now people, instead of farming, because that was the main trade of a lot of locals back then, instead of farming, they would be taking up government jobs, office jobs, and this. So they wanted to be more like the British. Instead of wearing the local clothes, they started wearing coats and trousers and ties, and started speaking English. The Britishers made it mandatory for everyone to speak English. So as soon as you started speaking English and dressed up like the British, you had more chances of success. And of course, that changed how people started building their houses, because the Britishers were making their houses in a bungalow style, which was essentially this walled boundary, this very strict wall with a huge lawn or green space, and the house at the center of the green space. So this was the idea of the bungalow in that era. Of course, they had a wall not just for security reasons, but because they wanted to view themselves as different, as separate from Lahore. So they wanted a private space of their own where Lahore would sort of cease to exist and they would be in their own part of Britain. So that's why they started having these houses with a boundary wall. And so instead of having an open space inside the house, like the pre-colonial house, now you have open space outside the house, surrounding the house. And what happened was that people who were sort of coming up in the middle class and the new elite, the local elite, they started buying land and making houses in the suburbs away from the walled city. So they wanted to make in the same manner as the Britishers were. The only difference was that they didn't have as much land as the British, because of course that's what the Britishers wanted. So what they did was, instead of having open space all around the house, they started pushing back the house. So this is a simple figure ground diagram. So they have sort of pushed their house back into the open space. One reason was that if a Britisher were to come in, like a senior officer, so they wanted to have this impression that I'm as powerful as you because I have the same kind of an open space in front of my house, and this would give like a dramatic entrance to the house. And the other reason was that it wasn't exactly easy for people to give up their previous lifestyle. They still needed that privacy, those private spaces. So they actually took the central courtyard and they pushed it into the back of the house, where the kitchen would be situated. So they kind of sort of mixed the two housing typologies. This is one of the early societies that was actually built in 1920s, and the idea was to accommodate the new rising middle class and let the locals become part of the economic system. So they actually, this was one of the first plans that was constructed in 1920. This is based on the Garden City movement, even though this is a much literal translation of the Garden
No,
City.
not very much. Yeah, Ebenezer Howard.
Yeah. And that's actually a critique of the city, that Howard didn't exactly meant his diagram to be a literal garden city, but that was more of an idea. But the model town, even the name suggests that how they viewed this as a utopian new Lahore. So the way the plan was, they actually planned in a way that the Muslims would be taking up one corner, the Sikhs in one, the Hindus and the Christians. All the new rising middle and elite classes would have their own homes, and people started building their houses in the same way as they were seeing the British make them. So the Britishers could, because they had a very centralized housing system, they could easily shift their bungalow in terms of orientation, but because the locals were still needing that courtyard in the back of the house, so they were pretty much restricted in terms of orientation. So you see a lot of these houses in the same kind of orientation. And then comes Pakistan, 1947, which was when finally the Britishers left subcontinent after a lot of political struggle, negotiation, and violence. And then Pakistan and India were divided into two different countries. And this was pretty much a dark moment in Lahore's history and even the country's history, because the Britishers deliberately didn't exactly see through that the partition was done smoothly. They wanted to be sure that this suffered after we have left. So a lot of the legal issues were kept vague, there was a lot of fighting, there was a lot of ambiguity. So because of that, a lot of violence happened between the two countries when people from one country were shifting. So the Hindu population was moving from Pakistan to India, and Muslim population was moving from India to Pakistan. And along that way, a lot of massacre happened. And even today, people are not over the fact, and that's why even today, Pakistan and India consider the other country as the enemy. So there was a lot of mass riot, burning, killing, and just completely law and order situation broke down in August of 1947. And you can actually see this old image of Lahore, the walled city, and how much of it was destroyed. And people just looted everywhere. So as soon as you had people moving out, leaving behind all their belongings and houses, so the locals just started grabbing as much as they could. And even today, there are a lot of legal disputes over old lands, and because there is no exact record of who owned what. And because of this, again, Lahore going backwards in time and a lot of it being destroyed, it took many years for Lahore to recover, and so there was no major architectural work being done for at least a decade. So not until 1960s that they started making something again, because the first thing that it needed to solve was the refugee crisis, because hundreds and thousands of people were moving into Lahore and they needed to be housed. So they just came up with quick solutions, just mass housing without much thought to the infrastructure or the drainage, just focusing on as many houses possible in the least amount of time. So of course the infrastructure was much worse in that time. And after that there was still this question of, because now all of a sudden you had this vacuum, the Britishers for a century had created this new hybrid culture which wasn't exactly Indian or Pakistani, and it was sort of this vague mix, and now the British were not there anymore. So there was this question of what the new culture is going to be, or what the new identity is going to be. Is it a secular state? Is it an Islamic state? And that is reflected in architecture, because a lot of Pakistani architects, they believe that we need to adopt to modern design philosophies, and we really need to get rid of our past. And because also this was the time when modern architecture was at its peak globally. And because another reason for that was that the Britishers didn't really allow for any local architecture schools to develop. So any architect from the earlier generation of Pakistan, they were either being trained by British or they were graduating from European schools. So you had actually European architects designing in Pakistan. So they really adopted this colonial attitude that the local culture is inferior and we need to distance ourselves, and the modern movement is where we need to be heading. So a lot of architecture from this time in Lahore is very, what I would say, not even sustainable. For example, this Bathhouse made in 1962 was actually made by a foreign architect, and it's not sustainable, it's not climatically sensible, and it does not really function, not considered a very successful building. So you had a lot of these examples of just people not exactly making according to context, and it took a lot of years before some architects started emerging locally in Lahore, and then you have this revival of regional architecture. So one of that example is from 1978, Anguri Bagh housing by Yasmin Lari. She's one of the first female architects of Pakistan, and she stopped practicing quite a years back, but now she's more involved in with conservation and rehabilitation projects. So this was a mass housing project for the lower classes in Lahore to sort of focus on the housing crisis and settling in of the lower classes. So you can actually see some of those narrow streets, those public spaces, those courtyards in these houses as well. And she modeled these new houses in 1978 based on the older housing systems with the central courtyard and private spaces. And there were about 700 of these housing units, and the idea was that over time the people living in these houses would be able to build upon these houses, extend them, maybe add some floors, and maybe have some more autonomy over their spaces. And again, these houses are sort of clustered in close with sharing public space, so you have that same kind of interactivity between families. Another very important architect was Nayyar Ali Dada. Dada means grandfather. That's sort of like a nickname he got as a student. He graduated from the same National College of Arts, the Mayo School from where I graduated, and he was one of the first few architects who was trained in Pakistan. So you had like a completely local architect, and he sort of mixed the modern sensibility of architecture with a more regional understanding of climate. So he was able to have modern architecture which was more climatically sustainable. So this was his art center which he made in Lahore in 1979. This is situated on the same main road, the Mall Road, and it's considered a very important project of Pakistan because this shows that there's a possibility that you can still have a regional form of architecture, but without being too nostalgic about the past. you can have the best of both worlds, like how Kenneth Frampton outlines in his critical regionalism. Some more glimpses of the spaces. So you have these large open spaces, these large heights, these large volumes to allow for a naturally controlled climate, so you don't need a lot of artificial cooling in these kind of spaces. This is another project by him. So a lot of his projects are kind of done in the same direction. So it's modern, it's up to date, but yet it sort of tries to belong to the specific region, and he uses the red local brick as a design element. Not exactly as a structural element, he's still using concrete and modern building materials, but he uses brick as an aesthetic material. This is the open air theatre which he made in 1993. Of course, Pakistan's political history has been very unstable. We have had 3 military dictators, and every time that happened, all the culture would sort of go back, and everyone, the dictator would sort of hijack the discussion about architecture and design, what architecture should be. So we had one military dictator who was like a complete fan of modern movements, so he completely got rid of any regional language. And then the next military dictator was an extremist Muslim. He's the one who was responsible for creating Al-Qaeda and Taliban. So he had this idea that everything should be Islamic, but even he did not understand Islamic architecture. So we still have to see a more unified language if we are going to say that what Pakistani architecture is. But then again, that can be said about pretty much every country right now, because you have this fluid exchange of architectural styles now, that you don't see a lot of variation when you go from one country to another. So a lot of contemporary architecture, especially in the postmodern era, because the whole idea of postmodern is that you don't have a style anymore, you don't have a specific language anymore. So just to wrap up this lecture, so a couple of local, more well-known practices of Lahore and some of their projects. So you can see that there's no unified language. Of course, some practices would be more towards contemporary forms of architecture, more international styles or trends, and some would be trying to push a more regional, modern, more climatic or economic architecture. Another reason for that is that architects in Pakistan are not able to focus, but then again, that's somewhat like a global problem, that now you have a lot of architects focusing on retail, on commercial or corporate buildings. So there's not much space left for maybe mature architectural discussion of what spaces should be. So this is where Lahore stands right now. So maybe time will tell that what the architecture of Lahore would be. Maybe if we have some more years of political stability, we might be able to define all of these projects. But as of now, we're still kind of figuring our cultural identity, because you have these various suburbs and these various lifestyles. You can actually find all kinds of people, all kinds of lifestyle in Lahore today. And of course, Lahore is facing a lot of problems with the urban sprawl, rapid expansion without any consideration about the economic condition of the lower classes or climate. And but there are a few good things in Lahore happening now. At least now, today's architects are much more aware of the heritage, of the architectural heritage. There is now a rising awareness of the importance of understanding your context, understanding your region, and then developing architecture, even if you have to use modern tools or modern construction techniques. And now there are new conservation efforts, like the walled city examples I showed you. So a lot of work is being done in the walled city to restore some of that, some of those buildings, some of that architecture, to have a more profound understanding of architecture in Lahore. So maybe one day, if any one of you would like to visit Lahore, you would be my guest, and I would be glad to show you around. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.